Hey everyone, and welcome back to my writing channel. Today I'm filming a video that I have wanted to film for a very long time actually, and the one thing that has kept me from recording this video is that I really want to do this topic justice. Trying to think about and remember all of the books that really had an impact on me as a kid is actually kind of difficult because this was before the days of Goodreads, this was before the days of Instagramming pictures of every book that I read. I didn't write down every book that I read. I rented like hundreds from my library. I was constantly going through books all the time and then just sent them back, and I never wrote it down. I never texted a friend, what I was reading or anything at this point. So what I tried to do when I was preparing for this video was just write down the ones that stuck out to me the most, that I remember now as an adult at the age of 27, that I remember still having a profound impact on me or my reading taste or even my writing, because I'm pretty sure every single one of the books on this list did affect my writing in some way, shape, or form. I wrote down all the titles and then I looked them up on Goodreads because I'm going to read you the description on Goodreads for any of the ones that are maybe a little bit lesser known that you might not necessarily recognize. And most of these books were published between like 2001, 2005-ish. So I was kind of a preteen in that time, or just before, maybe I was like 9 or 10. And then like up to the age of maybe like 14. In this video in particular, I want to talk to you about some of the series, because I think they all are series, but some of the books that really shaped me as I was a kid, as I was a preteen, and that I really enjoyed. A tiny little disclaimer before I get started is that I have not reread almost all of these books, so I can't say if they stand the test of time. I don't know as myself reading them today if I would still enjoy them. I don't know if even readers of today would necessarily enjoy all of these books. I don't know. Just a tiny disclaimer, keep that in mind. I have no idea what they would be like reading today, and that actually might make an interesting experiment in the future. So the very first series that had a huge impact on me and that I still talk about sometimes is Nancy Drew. You might know this already if you've watched some of my other videos, but when I was a kid, the very first actual stories that I remember writing and got very serious about, I typed them up on my dad's computer and I printed them out and I bound them and I gave them to family members and to friends. I was super serious about this, but it was completely based off of Nancy Drew. It was kind of plagiarizing Nancy Drew, let's be honest. It was a copy. I absolutely devoured this series. Like, if my library had had the algorithms that websites do today, it would have just only ever recommended me Nancy Drew books. I have two sisters and both of my sisters also read Nancy Drew, especially the one that's a bit closer in age with me. So often I would go and rent a bunch and she would go and rent a bunch and we'd read each other's and we'd just read them all because we read so much at that point. If for some reason you're not really familiar with what this series is, it's about an 18-year-old detective who gets put in all these situations where she has to solve mysteries. She goes on adventures, she's super smart, you get to kind of solve a mystery. It's really fun, and it's why when I first started writing, I wrote mystery and not fantasy. It was before I really kind of got started on my fantasy craze. And then probably around the age of like 10 or 11, I really started segueing into almost all fantasy. The next series that I really remember absolutely adoring, and this was another one that I read completely through. I rented a bunch from my library. I think some of them I had to buy because my library didn't even have them because I was reading them as they were being published. But that is the Rangers Apprentice series. So I looked at the first book on Goodreads, and the little blurb that they have for it is, "They always have scared him in the past, the Rangers, with their dark cloaks and shadowy ways. The villagers believe the Rangers practice magic that makes them invisible to ordinary people. And now 15-year-old Will, always small for his age, has been chosen as a Ranger's Apprentice." I will be completely honest, I do not remember very much about this series, except that it was adventure-packed, it was fantasy, it was so much fun, and it was a series, so I got to kind of go one to the other, to the other, to the other. I remember living vicariously through this protagonist. I vividly remember putting myself in the place of this ranger. And there are also little things about it that still stick out to me. Like, for example, I think it was in the first book. This is one of the only very vivid moments I remember, but there's a place where the protagonist makes a remark about people so rarely looking up because he's like scaling the side of a building or something and the person doesn't notice him. And he points out the fact that people just don't look up. And that struck me so hard that now as an adult, I still think of that all the time. Like when I'm opening my windows of my apartment and people aren't looking up, it still comes to mind once in a while. Like, yeah, people really just don't look up, do they? And it was from this series. I remember it being from this series. I think it's even the first book, but I'd have to reread them to actually know for certain. Little things like that really stuck with me from this series. And I think the sort of vibe of, you know, that adventure fantasy, this young protagonist who is trained in these abilities and these skills. And yeah, I don't know, there's something about it that I think really put me on the path towards a lot of the literature that I read following it. As my love for fantasy was really starting to grow, I also discovered Gail Carson Levine, and specifically I read all of her books that were kind of coming out, like Ella Enchanted and Ever and Fairest and all of those, but specifically one book of hers that I still to this day remember being so impactful was The Two Princesses of Muammar, and I hope I'm saying that right, I don't actually know. The Goodreads blurb is as follows. 12-year-old Addie admires her older sister Meryl, who aspires to rid the kingdom of Muammar of griffins, specters, and ogres. Addie, on the other hand, is fearful even of spiders and depends on Meryl for courage and protection. So, etc. There's sort of a little bit of the premise. Again, you can read the full blurb on Goodreads. I think the reason this book really resonated with me even more than the others was that it's about sisters, and I grew up with two sisters. We were very, very close. Often we would read the same books and we'd talk about them and discuss them and exchange books and all of that. It was also about a little bit heavier themes. I'm not gonna spoil anything in the book, but it had fun and adventure and fighting and fantasy and all of that, but it also had themes of family and of loyalty and friendship between sisters, and just kind of deeper, heavier themes that were for an audience of my age at the time. Again, this is one that I would love to read as an adult because I think those themes would hit me differently and would affect me differently. But as a kid, I absolutely loved it. I read it so many times. I still remember that was one that I would constantly go back and reread. And my sisters read it, my mom read it with us. And like I said, I read so many of her other books as well, and I loved all of them. I reread most of them as well, but it's just this one was the one that stuck out amongst all the rest. All right, so I feel like with this next series, we're sort of shifting just a little bit. I don't think there was a huge shift in age from when I read these past series that I just talked about and these next ones I'm going to talk about, but there was definitely a little bit of a shift in my mindset and my reading level, really. So next we have the Books of Pellinor, the first of which is called The Naming, and this was definitely the first female protagonist series, like epic fantasy, high fantasy series that really swept me away. Okay, I'm definitely gonna pronounce this protagonist's name wrong. I apologize in advance. Mayrad is a slave in a desperate and unforgiving settlement, taken there as a child after her family is destroyed in war. She is unaware that she possesses a powerful gift, one that marks her as a member of the school of Pellinor. It is only when she is discovered by Cadvin, one of the great bards of the Eragon, that her true heritage and extraordinary destiny unfold. Reading this now, I can definitely see all of those tropes that this book definitely encouraged in me, and I'm starting to see why when I did that video about my favorite tropes, maybe I really like some of these very stereotypical tropes. It's high fantasy, it's epic. It was definitely a factor in my very first book, which I started writing when I was 13, I believe, and I kept writing it sort of off and on throughout my teen years until I was about 17. So for those ages, I was probably still reading the Books of Pellinor as well, but they're very much like following these themes of mystical high fantasy, as you would have heard in the blurb. You've got the chosen one, you have this girl with a destiny who has powers that she didn't know about, all of these tropes that inspired me so much when I was writing my first book. I don't remember exactly all of the themes and the subject matter that was dealt with in these books because, again, it has been so long since I've read them, but I remember it just resonating really well with me. It's written by a female author. It's about a female protagonist who was probably around my age. She might be a little bit older, I can't remember exactly. I wish I could show you because I have all of these books still, I'm pretty sure, at my parents' house, but I don't have them here in my apartment in Paris, so I can't actually hold the books up, but this is one that I definitely remember. I bought all of these books, I didn't just rent them, so I have them somewhere on a shelf. Another high fantasy series that I was completely obsessed with was Eragon, and this is one that actually I never finished because it took so damn long for the last book to come out that I'd forgotten everything in the first books. So I actually feel a little bit weird about putting it on the list because I didn't read that fourth book, but the first book, especially the first two probably, had a huge impact on me, and a lot of that was both in the story as well as in the story of the publication. So the author, if I remember right, I'm going on a very long time ago memory, but if I remember right, the author published this book when he was around 16, So as like I think I was 14, 15 when I was first reading this, as someone who was already writing, who really wanted to be published, I really found this inspirational. So I absolutely ate up Eragon and Eldest, wait, what was the second book? Yes, it's Eldest, I remembered right. And then Brizinger, and then something else that I didn't read. I really do want to go back and finish this series, but I'm a little bit afraid that it's not gonna live up to my memory, because even just reading the blurb, I kind of was underwhelmed a tiny bit, but that doesn't discount the fact that it had such a huge impact on me when I was a teen, when I was reading this. It's very tropey, but at the same time, it is this really fun fantasy adventure, and there's something to be said for that as well, even if it is tropey. I'm not going to read you the blurb because I'm pretty sure most people have heard of Eragon. I'm sorry if I'm wrong in that assumption, but you can read it on Goodreads if you're interested. But it's a really interesting book, it's really fun, and I think it does resonate really well with that age group that I was at the time. I know you've been waiting for this one, but yes, Lord of the Rings is on this list, as well as The Hobbit. Like most people, The Hobbit was the first one that I encountered, and that was when I was pretty young. I don't remember exactly what age, but my mom used to read it sometimes to me and my sisters, and we absolutely loved it. All of us loved it. This was before we saw the movies, but then I'm pretty sure we watched the Lord of the Rings movies before we read the Lord of the Rings books. I know I definitely did, because I remember specifically I started with The Two Towers, and I would not have started with the second book in a series if I hadn't already been familiar with the story. I started Lord of the Rings probably a little bit too young, because the Lord of the Rings is very long. You guys know that. Tolkien was very long-winded. It's a beautiful story, but it's really difficult to get into as a kid. But I loved the movies so much that I really wanted to read them, and despite the Treebeard scenes in The Two Towers, which were definitely a bit of a drag, I still remember really liking it. And then I went back and read The Fellowship of the Ring, and then I finally read The Return of the King. And these are books that I have read since then. I've read them a few times, including once a few years ago, but these were definitely really, really impactful on me, on my writing as well as my reading, and they've stuck with me ever since. I have never stopped loving Lord of the Rings, and still to this day, if you had to ask me what my favorite series was, I would say The Lord of the Rings. Mostly because of the movies, I'm not gonna lie. I think the combination with the visual elements of the movies and the music and all these really, really powerful elements just enhance the story to new levels. But at the base, it's Tolkien's story. So in general, in terms of series, Lord of the Rings has to be my favorite. To close out this list, I have to mention Harry Potter, because I am part of the Harry Potter generation, so I feel like almost all of us have been affected in some way by these books. And the only reason this is not higher on my list or more sort of prominent on this list is simply because I don't think they really affected my writing per se. It's a bit strange, it probably did in ways that I didn't even realize, but I never remember writing something I wanted to be emblematic of it or really getting inspired in a direct way by these books. But they definitely inspired my reading, and I was completely obsessed with them, as were almost all of my friends. I read the first couple, I think maybe there were 3 out when I first started reading them and watching the movies as well. In fact, I think I watched the first 2 movies before I ever read the books, and then I realized how good the movies were and I went back and read the books. And then from about book 4 or 5 onwards, I was at like all of the midnight premieres for these new books. So again, even if they didn't directly inspire my writing, they probably inspired my writing. All right, I've been talking for a very long time, and I feel like I keep like fiddling with my bangs, so they're actually taking on a very weird shape. So I'm gonna wrap up this video now. I'd love it if you would leave me in the comments below some of your childhood favorite books, and definitely let me know if any of these on my list were also on your list. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it and subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications if you wanna know as soon as I upload new videos. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon in another bookish video.